Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by Spectator TV. My name is Freddy Gray. I'm the deputy editor of The Spectator, and I will be your host for this week's show. It's been quite a week in politics. The week began with Suella Braverman being sacked, and then the Lazarus-like reappearance of David Cameron, amid other bits of reshuffling from Rishi Sunak's government. I will be talking about that, first of all, with Kate Fall, Baroness Fall, who was David Cameron's right-hand woman when he was Prime Minister, and John Redwood MP. Next, we'll look at the Labour Party, which is also having difficulties this week over a rebellion against Keir Starmer to do with the conflict in Gaza, and a parliamentary vote on a ceasefire that was defeated. I'll be joined by James Heale and Carl Shoben, who used to advise Jeremy Corbyn and is now a political communications strategist. Amid all the political turmoil, there has been a little bit of good news for the government and for Britain more generally, in that inflation is at last coming down, or so it seems, based on October's figures. I will be joined by none other than Kate Andrews, our economics editor, to discuss what that means. And finally, we will talk about the rise in loneliness and single people and the connection that might have with social media and smartphones. I'll be joined by Dr. Jean Twenge, one of the world's leading experts on this subject, and the ever-brilliant Louise Perry. Before we get going, I should say that you should subscribe to this channel if you don't do it already. There's already 325,000 people who have made the very wise decision of clicking that subscribe button, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. I urge you to do that and make sure that you never ever miss an episode by clicking the bell icon as well. And of course, we should thank our brilliant sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in these challenging times. To find out more information about them, visit candowealth.com. I was the future once, said David Cameron in his last day in office as Prime Minister. Well, as the Spectator's cover piece by Katie Ball says this week, he is the future once again, after Rishi Sunak on Monday surprised everyone by bringing back David Cameron as his new Foreign Secretary amid a reshuffle, a bigger reshuffle. I'm joined to discuss this very surprising development with Kate Fall, Baroness Kate Fall, who was David Cameron's advisor for a long period of time, and John Redwood MP. I can't think of two better people to talk about this subject with. Kate, I will start with you. Everyone was surprised. May I ask if you were surprised? Did you have an inkling this was in the offing?
I had an inkling, but only just before
Right.
that it was happening. And I think it was a very commendable of Rishi to reach out to a tall poppy in his cabinet. I think David Cameron has the experience and status to be a really great foreign secretary at a time when, the world is really in a very difficult place with Middle East and Ukraine, rising tensions with China. So, I thought it was a very interesting and good appointment.
There's been a lot of talk this week about, the fact that he's a serious politician, that he brings skills and experience and so on. I suppose the fact that the story didn't leak might help add to the fact that he is a proper politician, because generally, when in the Tory party in the last few years, we're not used to them being able to keep surprises. Would you describe him as a consummate professional?
No, he absolutely is a consummate professional. He was very, very good and very focused on that wider national security role at his time in Number 10. People often don't realise that almost 50% of the Prime Minister's time is spent on that sort of wider beef, if you include, Home Office affairs as well. And he is passionate about it. It was sort of great and reassuring to see him today, I thought, with Zelensky. I'm sure he'll be turning his attention also to the Middle East. And I think when we look to next year, when you've got all these big elections coming, not least with the USA, a sense of will there be a vacuum in sort of global leadership? The fact that you have David Cameron there on the world stage, when Rishi, obviously Prime Minister, does some of that, but he'll be spending quite a lot of time thinking about the general election. So good, reassuring, I thought.
Well, you say that, Kate, but there are quite a lot of criticisms of David Cameron's foreign policy as Prime Minister, and perhaps quite a few very valid criticisms. I mean, let's start with Brexit, which obviously went wrong for him in a big way. You could also point towards Libya, where he was very much behind the intervention that ended up being a disaster for the region, possibly creating ISIS or certainly bolstering ISIS. And then lastly, of course, there is this issue of China, where he was very much behind the golden age. And Rishi Sunak's administration appeared to be very different on its positioning with China. And there are lots of questions about the amount of money that he has taken, possibly to shill for China in the last few years. I mean, that's that's three rather big things that he can be criticised over on foreign policy.
So just dealing with that, I mean, starting with Brexit, look, David Cameron put the question of our membership of the European Union at a point when people were feeling worried about where that was going to the British people. He argued for us to stay. He lost that argument and resigned. So I don't think that is a failure. I think it would have been a failure if he hadn't put it to the British people. Libya, look, one of the most difficult jobs as a prime minister is that question on your watch. What do you do to save lives? Often there's no perfect solution. There's a cost to either thing. So that with Libya, he went in, he was passionately trying to stop a terrible situation. With China, I think that is, a very interesting live issue. I'm sure John Redwood will have a view on this. Look, at the time when David Cameron was Prime Minister, he put forward a strong prosperity sort of narrative with China, but there was always the national security, the human rights angle, the sovereignty issue. But also China has changed. Xi was only just in place during that time. And look, he's moved towards a much more authoritarian way of running China. We have terrible things happening in Xinjiang. We have what's going on in Hong Kong. And I think, David Cameron will react to China of now, not to where it was all those years ago. So that would be my answer on the foreign policy piece.
John, I'll bring you in. You've seen a lot of reshuffles in your time. What was your reaction to what happened on Monday?
I think it was a great pity. My advice to prime ministers, which they've always ignored, is not to have general reshuffles. They are usually bad news, and I've never known one that suddenly changes the fortunes of a government favourably. I think we need much more professional management of ministerial talent and MP talent. There needs to be proper talent mapping. There needs to be mentoring and encouraging. Ministers need to be given a defined task, and it needs to be reviewed on a regular basis by their immediate superior, so that you don't get to a point 1 or 2 years in where you're standing by your phone not knowing whether you're good, bad or indifferent, whether you're going to be promoted or sacked. I think it's totally unacceptable. And you create too many people who don't like you as Prime Minister, because quite a few of the people who sacked didn't particularly deserve to be sacked. It was just some argument about, you need to open it up to different types of people or something. I think David Cameron was more sceptical than most about reshuffles, sort of got talked into them. But this one, I think, did backfire badly, as we've seen. And we now have to get behind the new team to try and get the show back on the road, get people talking about what really matters, which is what work are we doing for the country? How are people's lives going to be better? How are the Conservatives going to stop the small boats, get the economy growing and get inflation down as quickly as possible? Because those are good aims, but they were knocked a bit by the events of the last few days.
There is among people in SW1 or Tories in SW1, you do pick up a certain nostalgia for the Cameron years, because they came before Brexit and the chaos of Brexit, and they came before the pandemic and the disaster of the pandemic. And you do pick up this sense that in the Cameron years, possibly because they're in coalition, the Tory party had more drive, more sense of purpose, more competence. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that formulation. I think David's great achievement was to give us the referendum. I agree with Kate on that. As one of those who wanted a referendum, I was delighted when he saw the wisdom of doing it. I was sad that he backed so strongly the side that I always thought was bound to lose, and associated himself with a set of totally bogus and wildly wrong economic forecasts in an effort to say that Britain as an independent country couldn't do well. I thought that was very disappointing. And I understand why he resigned. I think now he is our foreign secretary. I've always found him friendly and easy to get on with, and he's a great communicator. He's very able. I think those are all great things in a minister, so I wish him every success. And now he is our foreign secretary, but I think he does need to reassure the half of the country that desperately wanted to leave the EU and wants a government that strongly believes in Brexit and starts using freedoms it's given us, because we're not using many of the freedoms we gain. That we need reassurance from our foreign secretary that his thinking has moved on, and that he knows he's part of a Brexit government which was elected on that single pledge, really, to get Brexit done. And would he help us get it done properly? Because we're still too tied to some of the EU laws and problems, and there are huge opportunities. And he should, above all, tell people, as I do, that our big win already is that the EU is spending and borrowing on a colossal scale, and the UK would have had much bigger demands on our money for EU purposes, and we'd have had to guarantee the debts of others through the EU borrowings. And isn't it great that we don't have that added complication in a difficult economic situation?
Kate, there's a lot of talk about Rishi trying to bring the Tory party back to the centre ground by bringing Cameron back. And possibly sort of pushing himself away from the Tory right. Do you buy that, or do you think it's media piffle?
I think bringing David Cameron back was really about putting someone really serious in that very important post at this time. I also think there was an element of sort of trusted advisor. I mean, there is no doubt that as a leader of a party, especially a prime minister, when you come into an election, there is a bit of sort of loneliness of power. You know, the weight of that falls on your shoulders. You're putting yourself up for election on behalf of your party. I think having someone with you there who understands that feeling will be, you know, really, really helpful to Rishi. In terms of the sort of centre-right, I mean, it does look, I think people think that because Suella Braverman left as David Cameron came in, so they see those two together. But overall, I think that the reshuffle seemed to me to be quite balanced. He brought in Esther McVey. He's put in people that he likes and respects. This was his first time. It was much more his cabinet, his government. He inherited really from Liz and didn't want to fire a whole bunch of people when he came in. So I just think it's a very personal set of appointments.
John, what do you think about all the talk of Sunak effectively giving up on the red wall, trying to shore up the blue wall with this reshuffle?
Well, I don't think that's the right interpretation, and it would be a crazy policy, because you've got to address both audiences, and on some issues, the two audiences are actually united. I mean, they both like some tax cuts and some growth, so that the kind of things I recommend are designed to bring the party together around good conservative policies that would improve the economy, improve the lot of British people, and would actually be good news in both parts. But I don't think he's cut loose from the red wall, because his number one aim, he keeps on telling us, is to stop the small boats. And that's much more popular in the red wall than it is in the so-called blue wall seats, where more people are more relaxed about numbers of people coming into the country. So no, I don't think he's given up on that at all. I think what he's got to do, though, is to cut loose from some of the extremely bad official advice he's been getting on everything from migration to the economy and to inflation, because the official advice has been followed too slavishly. And we've ended up with borders are not under control. We've ended up with an inflation rate that was more than 5 times the Bank of England's target, and more than 5 times the Bank of England's forecast. And we've ended up with no growth at a time when you can get the economy growing, as we see over the Atlantic, with the United States of America recording 4.9% growth in its most recent figures, despite itself having a bit of a monetary problem and crunch as well.
Kate, you mentioned Xi Jinping earlier and his authoritarian turn. He had a meeting with Joe Biden yesterday, which seems to have gone fairly smoothly, obviously differences of opinion on lots of things. And Joe Biden at the end called Xi Jinping a dictator again. I'd like to ask you, do you think David Cameron thinks that Xi Jinping is a dictator? And how do you said earlier that he's because China has changed, David Cameron's position may have changed a little bit, but he hasn't changed. Cameron hasn't changed much on China, it seems to me, up until very recently. I mean, only 3 weeks ago, he was in Sri Lanka speaking in support of the Colombo Port project, which is a big China-funded project. And I accept that he wasn't being paid directly by China or anything but for that, but yet it is clearly supporting a Chinese expansionism, which concerns a lot of people. How's he going to handle China?
So, I mean, obviously, you'll have to ask him that. I mean, look, it was interesting to see Biden and Xi meeting yesterday. There is a sense that everyone in the West has become much more scrutinizing of China, especially on the economic front, so calling out concerns that they have over human rights, national security, and sovereignty for us in Britain. Obviously, Hong Kong is top of that agenda, but the Americans more focused on Taiwan, and that's a focus for us too. But there is also the sort of economic prosperity angle to this, and I'm talking about British prosperity. And I think, we want to try and find a balance, don't we, to make sure that we scrutinise, but we also make sure that we, do trade with one of the biggest economies in the world. And it's about finding a balance and being, really careful about it. I also got the impression, looking at that meeting, that the Americans are trying, to create some sort of, they don't want it to get out of hand. When the Chinese balloon went up the other day, there was a concern that no one knew who to phone. It wasn't like the old days with the Soviet Union where they had the sort of red phone. So, I mean, it's the most important relationship, and I really hope we get that right. And I think we need to be careful, but we need to be addressing British interests at all the time and working with our allies, especially in the G7, which has become a really functional unit in terms of trying to get this one right.
John, what do you think about that? Do you think the last few years have shown that for the global economy to function for the West, for America, for Britain, China is just something we're going to have to deal with, we're going to have to work with, and that people like David Cameron and perhaps to a certain extent Joe Biden have the right approach in being accommodating where they can?
Well, I don't think there's any point in making an enemy unnecessarily, but you've got to be realistic about China. And I think the West has been very unrealistic about China. I think they haven't understood just what a brilliant strategy for China Xi has developed in order to dominate markets where we no longer have a strong presence. I mean, for example, it is the West that is taking their respective economies on the road to net zero. China isn't. China is still expanding her CO2 output to the world on quite a big scale and produces 30 times as much as the UK. And yet it is China that has bought up all the reserves and technologies and put in the production capacity to make the batteries and the electric cars and the solar panels and the wind turbines that we may now have to buy as imports from them. And I think this shows that the West was negligent in the way it responded to the commercial challenge of China. Kate says we need to protect the trade. Well, I don't think there's any problem about protecting the trade because it's more important than export. And China at the moment still wants the revenues from selling us things. The issue, which the UK has got to define for itself as America is increasingly doing so for herself, is on what terms do you allow Chinese trade? And we are getting, rightly, I think, much more nervous about things that entail technology sharing or gifting or selling technology to the Chinese, given how good they are at exploiting it and how we need basic capabilities and basic productive capacities at home for a whole variety of self-sufficiency and defence reasons.
John and Kate, I think we'll end it there, but thank you both very much for joining Spectator TV. Now, Rishi Sunak's been having a very difficult week, but it's not exactly an easy week for Keir Starmer. Last night in the Commons, 56 Labour MPs voted against him after a Labour three-line whip on the issue of Gaza and the ceasefire. I'm joined now by James Heale, our political correspondent, and Carl Shoben, who was formerly Director of Strategy for Jeremy Corbyn and now works for Salvation. James, I'll start with you. Rishi Sunak's had the Rwanda deal smash into a legal wall. Pretty bad week for him overall, I think we can say. People a bit bamboozled by Cameron and the Tory right rebelling a little bit against him. Do you think Keir Starmer arguably is having a worse week?
I would say probably not, just as a sort of pithy summary, but as a longer form of that, let me say that I think that, Rishi Sunak obviously on the Wednesday had the good economic news, which was welcome, about halving inflation, but that's been completely kind of sidetracked by what's been happening on this Rwanda deal. And I think that there was a press conference thereafter yesterday afternoon in which it left us with more questions than answers, whereby we're expecting to see some legislation brought forward under which we're going to have a treaty with Rwanda, whereby it's going to try and address the Supreme Court's concerns about people who are being deported back to their home country from Rwanda. But I think there's a lot of MPs sort of scratching their heads, going around, not sure yet what's going to happen. So we're waiting to see in the kind of days and weeks ahead what's going on. Then, of course, Keir Starmer, a few hours later after that, had this vote in the House of Commons, lost 10 front benches, either from resignation or because they were sacked, including 2 PPSs. But I would say that looking at the polls, if anything, are going even worse for the Conservatives. So although this issue of the splits over Gaza is going to be a very real one, and I think it's going to persist as long as there's the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, I think that much more electorally significant are the woes facing Rishi Sunak and the inability of the Conservatives either to find a sort of moment which is going to shift the dial on all of this, or second of all, get any political credit for some of the smaller achievements that they've tried to do. So I think for those reasons, it's been a worse week for Rishi Sunak than it has for Keir Starmer. Yeah,
it was quite a desperate question from me, admittedly, to try and suggest that that Keir Starmer is in as much trouble as Rishi Sunak. But Cole, I mean, I thought for a long time that the right-wing press, if you like, Tories, are very keen to emphasise the divisions that Labour has over anti-Semitism and over Israel, and now over what's happening in Gaza, and perhaps have overdone it. But then when you look at last night's vote, it is a significant rebellion. I mean, it is a headache for Keir Starmer.
I think it is. I think you can view this in 2 broadly slightly different ways. So from an electoral perspective, I don't think that what happened last night, or more broadly what's happening in the Middle East and the divisions within the Labour Party, will have much impact on the electoral situation. You could argue that the country is split itself, and you could argue that most people, according to the polls, don't really want to take sides on this. So you could say, in terms of tone, Keir Starmer is on one level reflecting the country as a whole, wanting to see both sides and wanting to see humanitarian pause and so forth. But at the same time, the majority of the country, by a large way, and in particular Labour voters, want a ceasefire. So what I would say that there's no real electoral damage, and Keir Starmer remains 20 plus points ahead in the polls. But it also reflects what I think is his strategic weakness, which is a massive over-emphasis on strategic positioning. So Keir Starmer is actually very unlike Tony Blair. They're often compared, but Tony Blair was a conviction politician like Margaret Thatcher in many respects. Keir Starmer makes his decisions and the people around him based on defining who they are and who they're not, rather than taking specific issues and running with them. And I think that is what he has done on this issue, starting off very badly with that LBC interview, because he was trying to use it as a wedge issue to define who he wasn't and to make a point about who he believes the Labour Party are. But I think what that will do is, while it won't directly affect him electorally, it creates a sense of who is Keir Starmer. You don't meet many people who are Starmerites. The people in focus groups, which we do a lot, are not wowed by him.
Yes.
They will vote for him as the least worst option. And I think this is storing up problems for the future.
Well, you do meet Corbynites, don't you? But plenty of them. But I mean, with Starmer, could you not frame it the other way and say this is an issue where rather than bending with the wind, rather than just being political, he's taking a political risk. He's losing political capital within his own party to stand up for what he thinks is the right thing for Labour to do.
I think that's exactly, in a way, what I'm trying to articulate.
Yeah.
So he's positioning himself because he wants to be seen as the Prime Minister, the responsible Prime Minister. I'm quite intrigued that they brief very openly that they're following the American line. That's the sort of thing that happens in politics, but they are saying it out loud.
Yes.
Because I think that on one level is what they believe strategically defines them as prime ministerial.
Yes.
But you've got 70 to 80% of the population saying they want a ceasefire. So there's two different levels, and I think Keir Starmer is very much batting towards the positioning to be seen as responsible. But I think that is potentially storing up problems for after the election.
I think there's been some missteps as well, and there's been some briefing around suggesting this is just about a left-right issue, etc. I think if you look at some of the names who quit yesterday, Jess Phillips, I wouldn't say was sort of necessarily of the kind of Corbynite left.
Corbynist
Exactly, yeah. Well, as some would perhaps suggest it. So I do think that although when we talk about the kind of the big picture and
She's a Phillipsite.
Yeah. Well, sort of, I wouldn't want to classify Jess's ideology, but I think that it really. I think while on one sort of national picture, you can talk about, say, it's not a huge impact. There are certain constituencies like Jess Phillips, which of course in 2005 were very much impacted after the Iraq War, and that went to the Lib Dems thereafter. So Jess Phillips only won that seat in 2015 and sort of taking off the Lib Dems. So I think that at a sort of granular level, some constituencies really are of concern. I only make the point as well is that, there was a great line in today's Morning Playbook which said that one former minister, since this war started 5 weeks ago, has had 11,000 pieces of correspondence about this issue, of which they say only 3 were in favour or supportive of Israel. So my point being is that this is a huge amount of pressure going on behind the scenes, and I do agree there is some issues of this approach of kind of strategising does mean that there's going to be a lot of issues that store up down the line. And I think as we have seen a couple of missteps over this, as the LBC interview demonstrated, but also they failed to take this seriously enough. There's a lot of anger bubbling up in the early weeks, and we've now seen the consequences belatedly of that in last night's vote.
Can I just say, I think that's right, and I was quite surprised and disappointed to hear Peter Kyle this morning talk about this as a Muslim versus Jewish issue in which Labour are seeking to kind of come down the middle. This is a massive issue, and the images on TVs get worse and worse every day. Yeah. And I'm just, this isn't Iraq politically yet, or nor likely to be, but it is, it is making people slightly further down the line wondering, what does Keir Starmer stand for?
You say you were disappointed by people mentioning the Muslim element of it. I mean, James says that it's hard to sort of collect the MPs that rebelled last night under any sort of group. But, I mean, quite a lot of them are people with constituencies with a large Muslim population. So, I mean, it is a factor, is it not?
I think it is. I mean, I think, and I don't like to talk electorally, in terms of electoral politics on an issue that is so horrific that we see every day, the damage that's being done. But most, bluntly, most Labour MPs, where there are large Muslim populations, are in city areas with safe Labour seats. I think the issue goes beyond electoral politics to issues of social cohesion. So I think MPs with large Muslim communities will be concerned about the feedback they're getting, and they'll be concerned about the level of discontent within their constituencies, rather than, I think, worried about losing their seats, although there might be some examples of that.
Yeah. James, do you think this can only get worse as a problem for Starmer? Because as the war goes on and gets worse, which seems to be likely to happen, the anger about it will only bubble up. The demands for the just humanitarian pauses will be seen as not enough, and the demands for a ceasefire will only increase. Yeah,
I mean, remember, of course, that these resignations, they're still going in the PLP, there's still going to be noisy voices. We've already seen on our coffee house list, which we keep up to date on the website, a third of Labour MPs have called for a ceasefire. These are issues that are not going away soon. I'd just like to make the point that, of course, the reason we had this vote last night was because of the SNP motion. The SNP have done a brilliant bit of parliamentary chicanery at one point, exposing divisions in the main opposition and differentiating themselves on this huge substantial issue. Next week we're going to see a vote at Holyrood, which we expect Scottish Labour will be under a lot of pressure to call for a ceasefire. I think because of different reasons, etc., there's a much sort of greater emphasis in Holyrood and for a ceasefire compared to, say, the Conservative government here in Westminster. So I think that's going to be the key issue, and trying to exploit those differences between Holyrood and Westminster in terms of the Labour leadership. Remember, of course, I mentioned Iraq earlier in this conversation. Iraq was a big issue in why Scottish Labour lost support, and there were the accusations that Scottish Labour was merely a branch office for the Labour leadership in Westminster, which was seen as being, not listening to the concerns of those up in Edinburgh. So I therefore think that this is going to be a kind of issue that's going to be bubbling away, and certainly the SNP, who are really fearful about the impact that Labour seem to be making in Scotland in terms of making inroads into their support there, are going to be determined to try and exploit this for all they can. And so last night's motion was a part of that. So I think there's a lot of different moving pieces of this picture, of which when we talk about, say, big cities in London, with sort of big Muslim populations, that's just one part of it. I do think that there's also the Scottish element to consider as well. As you say, Freddie, it's one of those things where it may not be seen as kind of having an impact in the polls, and I think that the calculation made by Labour is that it's better to kind of keep on this path in order to be seen as the patriotic, sensible party, etc., in which they're standing with the British government, and in which that they were trying to win over those 2019 Tories. That's the calculation, but there's a lot of dangers within the Labour coalition, and I think that it would be a mistake to underestimate the sentiments. And for the past 50 years or so, this has been a key fault line on the left, Israel-Palestine. So I think that there's been a bit of a blasé attitude in certain quarters about this.
Well, let me ask you, Carl, and again, I realise we're just talking to political tactics about a humanitarian tragedy, but the Scottish element is interesting. Certainly, if you look at the Corbyn years, going against slightly what James said. I mean, you had someone who's very obviously dovish in his foreign policy, and yet Labour didn't do as well in Scotland as you might have expected them to do.
I think throughout the Corbyn years, it dispelled the notion that what Scottish Labour needs is a left-wing leader, and that will bring back support. That didn't happen. That was sort of proved not to be the case. I think during the Corbyn years and before and after, until recently, the independence issue absolutely dominated. And the SNP were incredibly skillful strategically in presenting themselves as the centre-left party in Scotland. So, to that point, what was Labour even for? And I think the SNP managed to portray Scottish independence like Scandinavia, with good health, good public services, and that is broadly where Scottish voters are.
Yes.
I think it's only in the last 6 months, since there's been real tensions within the SNP leadership, and Labour has got an effective leader in Scotland, that Labour's managed to start pushing its way back.
Yes. Well, we'll leave it there. But James and Carl, thank you very much for coming on Spectator TV. In a difficult week for the government, there has been one piece of good news, and that is that inflation has dropped quite significantly in October, from 6.7% to 4.6%, which is something for Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt to cheer about. I'm joined now by Kate Andrews, our economics editor, to discuss. Kate, this is a piece of good news, isn't it?
It is a piece of good news. We can argue about who's really responsible for inflation dropping, but this is a significant slowdown. As you said, it has slowed from 6.7% on the year in September to 4.6% on the year in October. And the main reason for that is that a lot of that energy data, that huge surge in energy costs from last year, has now fallen out of the figures. And instead, it's reflecting the fact that Ofgem, the energy regulator, actually lowered the price cap more recently. So you're now taking into account much better data, much better costs on energy. So we've seen that significant drop. I should note that core inflation, which excludes those more volatile prices like energy and food, is still significantly higher, around 5.7%. That suggests that a lot of this inflation has really ingrained itself into the system. Prices are higher. Of course, the inflation rate being at 4.6% overall means prices are still going up. So it's not to say that this is any less painful of a time for consumers. But the key here is that at the very start of the year, Rishi Sunak laid out 5 pledges, and halving inflation was his first one, and he said his top priority. Based on this data, this most recent update from the Office for National Statistics, the government can quite safely say that it has achieved that target. So one of 5 pledges. Obviously, this week they've had much more difficult political news on the Rwanda ruling, but on inflation, they can say that they've halved it.
Well, and he did also say in the pledges that he would deliver inflation this year, and 3 months to go, 2 months to go.
Well, that's it. He's hit it ahead of target, it looks like. Now, we should note that in theory, this number fluctuates. Inflation often doesn't go down in a straight line, as we've seen this year. So in November, in December, in theory, you could get a higher rate. And actually, the forecasts look like it's going to be really difficult now to take the inflation rate from about 4.6% back down to the bank's target of 2%. That process looks like it's going to take over a year to achieve. They're not expected that to be reached until 2025. So there's still a long way to go. And these things do fluctuate, but it seems almost certain now that the government will be able to say that it technically achieved its target.
You pointed to the crucial point there, which is that the government can't really take credit for it. There are much bigger forces at play that it has nothing to do with, and the Bank of England plays a far more important role. But it is very keen to take credit for it. This morning at 8:59 a.m., I had an email from Jeremy Hunt.
Did you personally?
Yeah, it felt very personal. It said,
well, actually, can you read out the headline?
I'll read out the headline. It said, "Have you seen our promises, Frederick?" That's the name that the Tory party database has for me, clearly.
Sure. Very formal.
"Frederick, this is a quick note to let you know, as of today, we've halved inflation. That's what we promised to do, and we delivered. So why not share the news with a friend?" Of course, I forwarded it straight to you, but you'd already got it.
I had already got it, but it was thoughtful of you to think of a friend. Love those phrases, quick note.
Quick note.
We can just circle back on those other pledges sometime.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's quite irritating, isn't it? Especially when inflation doesn't really feel like it's come down at all. And everybody is angry about high prices. Voters are angry about high prices. To have the government sort of bragging in a weird email marketing way to you is quite annoying.
I think there are 2 major risks here. The first is exactly what you've just said, Freddie, that people will receive that email and think to themselves, I don't feel better off. And that's because you're not better off. The situation is less bad than it otherwise could be, of course, if inflation were still in the double digits. But prices are still going up, and they're going up at a much higher rate than the Bank of England is supposed to be targeting. So come the end of the year, come next year, people may still feel worse off. I suppose the glimmer of good news here is that average wages, excluding bonuses, do now outpace inflation, but that's only been happening for a few months, and it's only about 1.5%. So, people might feel like they can just about pay their bill in a more comfortable way, but nobody's sitting around feeling especially rich because of this news that the government has halved inflation. The other difficulty, of course, is that critics are going to point out that this is not really in the government's remit. Rishi Sunak's number 1 priority was something that is ultimately determined by the Bank of England because they have the tools to bring inflation down, and that's mainly interest rates. And those 14 consecutive interest rate hikes, those painful hikes, have largely contributed to why inflation is halved. Now, Jeremy Hunt might say that the government does.
Our friend Jeremy.
Our friend who forwarded the email. He might say, not in this email, more broadly speaking, that the government does have a role to play, but that role is really one of fiscal prudence, not direct action. So you could make the case that not giving in to demands for more spending, not giving in to demands for more subsidies, as some tried to do around mortgages this year, for example, around being more cautious with pay raises in the public sector, especially around the NHS, that those decisions to not spend money were an active part of bringing inflation down. He has a point. I see what he's saying, but we know that main lever is interest rates, and politicians simply have to watch on as the Bank of England, the Monetary Policy Committee, makes those decisions. The bank has not been so great. This has been a painful process, a slow process. Great that we've halved inflation, but the UK is still a bit of an outlier compared to the Eurozone, compared to the US. Our inflation is still notably higher than in those places. So it's really hard for anybody to pat themselves on the back. But again, if we're framing this in terms of pure politics, something the Prime Minister said, judge me on, you can judge him on and say that he has technically met his target. Whether or not it was ever his target to meet, whether or not it's good enough are separate questions, but he has met what he said he'd do.
Speaking of the Bank of England, I know one of your favourite games is Guess
the Bank Rate.
Guess the Bank Rate.
Do you love that game? Do you enjoy when I play that in the office?
We have so much fun when
we do.
Yeah. What is your prediction? I mean, the market seems to be anticipating now, particularly with America, good inflation news from America, that rates will start possibly even coming down now.
So we have one more meeting for the Monetary Policy Committee before the end of the year. They have now decided, they voted to hold rates twice so far at 5.25%. Those have been contested. They've been tight, as the governor of the Bank of England likes to say. You don't have full agreement on the committee. I suspect that today's numbers make it a lot less likely that we'll get another rate raise because it really does look like the rate raises we've had so far are working. Again, you could contest this and say, well, the bank is still more than double its target. But the fear, of course, is that if you take those interest rates too far, you could trigger a recession. I mean, interest rates are taking that heat out of the economy. They're trying to make you spend less money. And if you get that balance a bit wrong, you fall on the wrong side of a recession. Given the fact that the UK essentially has virtually no growth, that Q3 saw no growth. If we do get growth this year, that's another one of Rishi Sunak's pledges. That will be on a technicality, basically. So the Bank of England has to be very cautious with that. I suspect today's figures make it much more likely that we have hit that peak rate. But as to when interest rates start to come down, Andrew Bailey's been very clear that that's going to be a while longer. They don't feel like the rate hikes so far have been fully fed through the system. They're still not fully felt. They feel like that needs to happen before you start talking about bringing interest rates down.
And you've written very eloquently, as always, about Bidenomics and the similarities between Bidenomics and the way Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt view the economy and are handling the economies in their respective countries. There's another similarity, I think, in the showing up in the polls, which is that, and certainly if Jeremy Hunt keeps talking about inflation like that voters, nothing drives voters more crazy in America than Biden's White House constantly insisting that the economy is great. Look at the numbers, they're fantastic. Whereas everybody who's asked, or large numbers of the population who are asked, feel like they're significantly worse off.
Well, this is fascinating because the difference in America and the UK right now is quite startling. In America, in Q3, they saw something very close to 5% uptick in GDP. The UK saw 0. Yet Americans look at that figure and all the polling suggests that they don't feel that. They don't personally feel the impact of that growth. And of course, when we're talking about GDP, that's a meaningless phrase to most people. We're talking about wages. We're talking about new job opportunities. We're talking about opportunities overall, more prosperity, things people, actually do feel and understand. And Americans aren't feeling that. And it does seem like that $1 trillion sugar rush that Biden pumped into the economy, no one's really buying the long-term benefits of that. I think the UK has a slightly different problem where there's no growth to debate. I mean, it's a luxury to debate whether or not 5% growth is particularly meaningful or not. We're not in that position.
Thank you, Rishi and Jeremy, I suppose. Yeah.
But they've been doing very different things, right? Biden's been spending the money. To be fair, Rishi Hunt and Jeremy Sunak have also been spending quite a bit of money. In the March budget this year, their main rabbit out of the hat was a lot of money for more childcare subsidies in the coming years. But they have been more fiscally prudent. They have to be, for many reasons. The debacle with the last year's mini budget and what that did to market confidence. The UK is not the reserve currency. It can't just keep spending money. Interest rates, of course, skyrocketing. The UK is looking to pay over £100 billion simply to service the debt in this fiscal year. You don't get anything new for that. That's money we've already spent. So The situations are different. The responses are different. That uniting front, Freddie, is that you can point to certain data points, and ministers are in the UK and the US, and saying, look at how great this is. The response from the public tends to be, no, sorry, we don't buy it, we don't feel it, we're not better off. And this isn't really party political, so to speak, because you've got a Democrat president, you've got a conservative prime minister. People just feel like the current economic situation on both sides of the pond is fragile and frankly quite painful.
On that cheerful note, let's end it. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thanks, Fred.
Now let's talk about a frankly terrifying topic, which is the sharp increase in loneliness and singledom or singlehood among people, especially young people. There have been many studies reporting an increase in people being single and concomitant rises in anxiety, depression and suicide as a result. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jean Twenge, who is the author of a new book called Generations, The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers and Silence and What They Mean for America's Future. Jean is a leading expert on this field. She's also the author of a book called iGen that really broke down a lot of the boundaries into the research into this subject. And I'm also joined by the wonderful Louise Perry, who is a Spectator contributor and author of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Louise, you've written about against the sexual revolution. Do you think this is a combination of smartphones arriving on top of habits that have been happening or have been forming for decades now that have led to young people being more isolated?
Yeah, so I think smartphones are surely a factor, as Jean says. I think there are lots of ways in which tech has kind of addled the brains of young people. I mean, the thing is about getting married, starting relationships, it's really a very, very difficult coordination problem. You know, finding the right person at the right time, knowing that you're a good match and are going to be a good match long term is actually a really hard thing to do. And often, you know, if it works out, sometimes it works out just through luck. But what's more common, I think, in most cultures is there actually to be more cultural templates, more social guardrails, less of an expectation that young people will just sort of work it out by themselves one way or another, with the assistance of various technology. One of the problems I think that young people do face now is that there isn't such an obvious sort of cultural pathway laid out for them in terms of this is what you do at particular times, this is how you grow up. Like it's kind of all to play for. As Jean says, you know, adolescence is increasingly extended. People are getting married and having children much later in life. So these kind of adult milestones are not being presented in the way that they once would have been. And what we're mostly seeing, you know, maybe some people are really enjoying that freedom, really enjoying the option to design their own life course. But actually, I think most people find a lot of comfort and reassurance in being slightly more old-fashioned about these things.
Jean, a lot of young people suffered during lockdown. This is pretty well established. And so therefore, do we have a sort of triple whammy effect of changing social patterns over decades, the smartphone, and then lockdown on top of that, which meant that a lot of children were only really had screens and perhaps family time to do socialization. Can you give us a sort of sense of the data there and how socialization or lack of it is affecting young people?
Yeah, I think that's true. The pandemic continued a lot of the same trends that were already there in the first place. That, you know, anxiety and depression among young people started to rise around 2012 and then kept rising during the pandemic with that, you know, other layer of stress. And then the same thing with these trends in social isolation, that we had already been seeing that for quite a while, that young people were spending a lot less time with each other in person. It's almost like they were in dress rehearsal for the pandemic and didn't know it. especially for Gen Z, who I define as those born roughly 1995 to 2012, where they've never known a world without the smartphone. So their social lives were already heading in that direction of isolation. And then the pandemic put another level on that in a way that I think coming out of the pandemic, it's been even more difficult for a lot of young people to come back to dating, to relationships, to being with friends in person, because they've often forgotten how to do it. And I think, a lot of older people felt that way too, but it was heightened for Gen Z because adolescence and young adulthood is a crucial period for developing those social skills. And that had already been going away. And then it just became the next level with the pandemic lockdowns.
Can you tell us a little bit about Gen Z? Because I think there was an assumption perhaps that children who grew up with the internet entirely, with social media entirely, would be able to come to terms with it, would grow used to it in a way that perhaps millennials weren't able to. But as I understand it, the evidence points the other way.
Yeah, that's right. And it is interesting because that I've heard variations on that argument, a fair amount, that say, these technologies like social media were supposed to connect us. They can allow us to be constantly connected. And, some people have said, well, if Gen Z is spending a lot of time on social media and online, they're mostly communicating with their friends. Who cares? That's the same thing that young people have always done. They're just doing it in a different way through a different medium. But one way to answer that question about does it matter and who cares is to say, what's the link to happiness? What's the link to mental health? And as social media became more popular, as more people got smartphones, that's exactly when we saw these very large increases in anxiety and depression and self-harm and even suicide among young adults and adolescents. Plus, we know that the more hours a day a teen spends on social media, the more likely that he or she is to be depressed. Some of the best data that we have on that comes from the UK Millennium Cohort Study, and that's what it found, that heavy users of social media among 14-year-olds, twice as likely to be depressed as those who did not use social media.
Louise, a lot of people dismissed fears about tech for a long time as technophobia and so on. I wonder to what extent people's instinct that there was something wrong with spending a lot of time with technology is down to their understandings of tradition and their understandings of important values that are almost innate. And that, of course, Jean's very important work has shown that the data backs up what people's instincts were. But to what extent do you think a sort of instinctive sense that traditional family life was being lost through technology plays a factor?
Yeah, I don't buy it when people say, oh, well, it's just like the printing press, isn't it? I mean, aside from the fact that the printing press triggered wars of religion that lasted a century, which is maybe isn't a great parallel if you're trying to excuse the harms of the internet. I mean, I think it should be intuitive, particularly when it comes to the effects on children, because any adult who uses screens regularly should surely notice the effect that it has on them. If you've spent hours looking at a screen, you're not just going to have a sore neck. You do normally have a kind of psychological malaise, which I think most people do notice in themselves. We know that smartphones are very addictive. We know that, using porn, using social media, all of these things affects our relationships, our social lives. I think that it ought to be obvious that all of those effects, which adults clearly identify, would be even more acute in children because they're still developing, and we need to be even more cautious around the sort of stimuli which we're presenting to children, which are incredibly novel. I mean, this is the thing about the internet that we just can't understate. It is so new still. It is so poorly understood still, just because it's only arrived in our lives in the last couple of decades. And I think that just hoping for the best and kind of exposing children to this as if they were guinea pigs and crossing our fingers is, I think, absolutely the worst policy. I think we should be much more cautious when it comes to children in particularly.
Well, Jean, there we have it. The problem is a very, very serious one. The question, of course, is what can be done about it. Obviously, you can put social pressure on parents to keep their children off phones, but that doesn't seem to be working. What can be done?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that parents are in an basically impossible situation because there's so little regulation around the internet and social media. You don't need parental permission to open a social media account. It's very easy for kids and teens to lie about their age. So a lot of times parents don't even know that their kids have social media. And with school laptops and other things that have to be done using technology, some of the benefits of technology, how do you know if your kid's doing homework or is on Instagram? It's very difficult to know that unless you're hovering over them all the time. And who can do that? I have 3 kids myself, and they're 11, 14, and 17. So this is my daily life as well as my research life. So I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for parents because it is tough. I do think there are a few things parents can do. Try to make sure that your children don't have their phones in their bedroom overnight. That's actually true for adults too, because you'll sleep better. And if you think you need it because it's your alarm clock, buy an alarm clock. And then if you have younger kids, delay getting them a full-blown smartphone. Give them a flip phone or a phone that's designed for kids where you can only call, text, and take pictures, and that's it. That doesn't have access to the internet or to social media.
I've seen Jonathan Haidt, who I know has done a lot of his work, is based on a lot of your research. And he's saying that 14 is a sensible age. Would you put that at about the right age for parents?
You mean to get a smartphone? Perhaps, although I would probably go for 16. I have a 14-year-old, and she has a phone that you can only text and call and take pictures. So, and I think, and John and I both agree that for social media, it should not be introduced until 16. Some people have even argued for 18. 16 is a nice compromise because then if young people want to read more news or get involved in politics, they can do so. But then, we know, in fact, the best data available shows us that the link between social media and depression is larger for younger kids and teens. So when they're older, there's not as strong of a link to depression. And so I think that is another big argument for age minimums.
Louise, I think your children are way too young to be even considering smartphones yet. But I'd like to ask you both, actually, because I know as a parent, the worst thing I do is set a terrible example with smartphones by being on mine all the time. Do you both, if it's not too invasive to ask, do you both find yourselves addicted to smartphones?
Horribly, which is why I do all sorts of things. Like I have my phone set to grayscale, for instance. If your phone's grayscale, it's much less addictive. I've found this. Colleagues in journalism and politics are astonished to hear I do not have the Twitter app on my phone. And in fact, I have it. I can only go on Twitter 20 minutes a day. I have a setting on my laptop. I have enough self-knowledge to realize that I'm completely addicted to this stuff, which is why I impose limits on myself and try really hard as well not to look at the phone when I'm with my 2-year-old. And he's got a lot of limits in store for him as well. I'm absolutely going to be applying all of these restrictions. I mean, I completely agree with Jean. It's really hard. Like, parents are in a massive pickle, which is where I honestly think that parents would be so relieved if the government brought in really quite strict restrictions to, for instance, banning smartphones for under 16s. I think actually 99% of parents up and down the land would be delighted because it would take the burden off them to be the harsh ones.
There we go. Rishi Sunak needs a popular policy, certainly at the moment. And Jean, you are now the leading authority on the dangers of smartphones. So presumably you're under quite a lot of pressure yourself to not be addicted to a smartphone.
Yes, although similar to what Louise was saying, it's all about limits. So yeah, that phone is not in my bedroom overnight. I do practice what I preach. I tend not to have it in my pocket. I think that's often helpful to not have it on you, all the time. To not have it around when you're having a conversation, in your family or with a friend. Just kind of setting those reasonable limits. And yeah, same thing with me. The only social media that I have is Twitter, and it's only on my desktop. I do not have it on my phone, and that's very purposeful.
I tried the grayscale thing, but I found almost unconsciously I switched it back to colour. But my father does a good thing, which is he turns off his mobile after he's used it, which I also think is quite a good habit to get into. Jean and Louise, thank you very much for coming on to Spectator TV. That's all we've got time for. I hope that none of you are lonely. Of course you're not. You're watching Spectator TV, probably glued to your smartphone. But that's the best way to be addicted to technology. Do come back next week and watch us again. And I hope you enjoyed the show. Bye-bye.